Freedom. Oh, the joys of freedom. Those fireworks a few days ago were pretty swell, if I do say so myself. It's Solomon again, all laid back in the temple. I can't quite tell so far if anyone is listening. Might help if I was hijacking a major channel, but for now I think I'd rather lay low. I'm not in the mood for that type of carnage. At least not yet. Still, it seems somebody is listening, as I've once again received an anonymous letter. This time while I was out and about. It's possibly another piece of the puzzle, but I'm not quite sure. Frankly, anyone could pen these up and send them over if they knew of my location. What intrigues me the most is that it references a recent element that I did not mention in my very first broadcast. And from the way that it's described here, it's an element that wouldn't sit too kindly for the people in charge, if true. But I'll let you good folks be the judge of that. Well, regardless of all of my monologuing, I'll say it once again for all of you groovy listeners. Curl up nice and cozy, lock your doors, keep a shotgun handy, and open your earwaves for tonight's riveting story. It's quite the discovery.
The Eastmouth podcast is written, directed, and narrated by DC Tullis. Based on the world created by DC and JD Tullis.
Welcome back to the most desolate radio show on Earth. As all of you surely know, we're a town of less than 2,000 people, and certainly none of us can say no to a fresh heap of lobster and fries. Maybe a cold lager, too. I just now realized that I never ate lunch. Anyway, even in a town such as this, we've got quite a few mysteries on the prowl. I go through the paper and far more books on town history than I ought to. But it seems that these letters are my most interesting source. So, my dear listeners, here's one that I received just this afternoon. Feel free to reach out to me with your responses. If you can find me, that is. I was listening to your last broadcast and have a story that might be of interest. Don't come looking for me. Ah, well, at least somebody understands privacy around here. My friend, let's call him C, invited me over to the woods beyond the old Deering stables for kicks. He wanted to go hunting. I wanted to make sure he didn't accidentally hit someone. They really should fix up those stables. Frankly, I haven't seen any townsfolk ever visit to ride. Maybe the state of the property is part of the problem. We'd met at the edge of the woods at around 7 o'clock, a good hour and a half before sundown. It was awfully cloudy, but there was no rain in sight. I'd managed to convince C that if we didn't find a deer quickly, we'd go for a malt. That had been my plan, anyway. It was certainly not what happened. We'd each brought our own gear, enough for a small camping trip, just in case of the worst. He was always a bit careful. Bolt cutters and water canteens, flashlights and snacks. The wind had been blowing coolly as we navigated along the edge of the fence on our bikes for a couple minutes. We finally found a place to stash them well in some bushes and then scaled the fence. No need for the bolt cutters so far, but you never really know. Once we were over the fence, he had a grin like no other, ready to finally put what his uncle had taught him to use. For me personally, I'd never been hunting before. I'd grown up caring for animals rather than shooting them. I couldn't quite dissuade him, so I hoped to at least make sure it was brief. A half hour in or so, flashlights out, We could already sense the darkening of the sky. The branches snagged our path, and thorny plants tugged at our jeans every time we took a step forward. Just to bring a sense of reality to what we experienced, I'd like to include our discussions too. At least as well as I can remember them. I don't think I can tell the story accurately and truthfully without them. I haven't seen a single animal larger than a squirrel yet, I'd said. We'll nag a deer, or at least something small like a rabbit, V. I'm starting to doubt that, I'd laughed, as we descended down a slight hill and into a muddy clearing. There's gotta be one around here somewhere. My uncle swears he's seen deer in this area. He picked up his tracking skills in the Second World War, and if he can navigate his way out of an ambush by just the prints on the dang ground, then he must have seen something here too. Are you sure that he wasn't a little too blitzed? Oh, come on, get bent. Well, you know how he likes his drink. He might not have come back quite all the... He cut me off and continued, I believe. We'll find one. Gotta keep one eye open and be real quiet. Just like a soldier. That's what my uncle said kept him alive in the war. Oh boy, he used to tell me all of these stories. Best damn trekker in the state. C had said something like that, but I'd already started to tune him out. He could ramble about his uncle for days. I mean, if he said he saw some deer out here, we'll find one. My uncle never lies. Was he drinking when he told you all of this? Well, his flask was out, yes, but I knew it. Remember when your uncle told you that you could catch more fish with a tennis racket and wood glue? Well, at least I caught a fish. You didn't catch any. I'll be interrupting here. This shouldn't need to be said, but don't listen to your drunken uncle when he tells you to break onto someone's property and start shooting. He may know how to catch a buck, but he's probably in his second marriage. C hushed and then pushed me down onto the leaves, catching me off guard. He crouched down too, aiming the scope of his rifle through the tree line. There was a moment of silence as he studied his barrel and took a few deep breaths. As he steadied and began to aim, I could almost hear the silence. And then the shot rang out. I'd cursed at how loud it had been, and then looked back to him. Please tell me it was a clean shot, I'd asked. And then there was silence. His lip was quivering. After nearly 10 seconds, he spoke. It was a whitetail, unlucky bastard. Then he stood up and offered a hand. It just doesn't feel real. We found it and shot it. There was no build-up, no waiting, no real tracking, no story to it. I'm not quite sure what to say. Say your old lady can cook it without burning it. We've got to at least use it well, right? He chuckled at that and nodded. Quite a catch, I guess. Fresh venison is so much better than anything you can get at the A&C. At least it wouldn't be sacrificed by my mother at the stove. The woman can't even heat water without scalding herself. And then there was a gust of wind that brushed right past us. An icy chill, blowing in from the sea, almost as if it had been waiting for something to happen. At certain times, usually late at night, I really start to think about moving to someplace warm. We've all thought of moving at one point or another. Frankly, there's been days that Texas sounds just swell. Really though, I doubt you could get a good lobster bisque to save your life. That deer ended up being far heavier than I expected it to be. Frankly, and quite selfishly, I almost wish he shot something smaller. We soldiered on. I was excited for whatever his mother would cook. As we continued, he switched the conversation. He was talking about how his uncle planned to give him a rifle for his birthday. He was awfully hooked on the idea. On and on he went, detailing the training he'd underwent. We made it a good number of minutes since the kill. Under 10 and more than 5. Desperately, I tried to keep my mind on anything else as the weight bore on my arms. Over fallen logs, around little ponds, slowly dragging the unfortunate remnants of whatever beautiful soul had once been stuck in that body. As I'd started to drift from the conversation again, C dropped to his knees and began to crawl his way to a bush nearly 15 feet in front of us. A straight path up a leaf-strewn incline. He turned around for a second to put a finger to his lips before he continued up it. And as I was unaware of what brought on such a sense of caution, I followed right up after him. Each step forward scraped against my knees, but I kept on. The voices then came suddenly through the wind. 2 men, it sounded like. They must have been nearly 50 feet from us. One began to speak in a raised voice. I crept next to C and burrowed myself in the bush. There was no way to see us, and we couldn't see them well either. And yet, they certainly could have heard the earlier gunshot. Angry townsfolk meant a lot of explaining and unpleasantries. We were on private property, after all. It was raspy, one of their voices, like sand coursing through a cheese grater. What they did was wrong. He was the last blockade. What's a little myrrh? Stop! I don't even want to comprehend this. I could smell just the faintest hint of a cigarette from where we hid. You act as if he was just an object. Might as well have been. Just like the orchard or any of the old council members. That's vile. Is it really? The land is prime and its owner is quite enjoying Italy. Frankly, I'd say it's an unjust analogy. You're disgusting. We could have at least preserved it. And now it'll just be some housing plots, and that church they all fuss about. It's just the way the voting went. Come on, why is your head still all wrapped up in the business of it? Did you pay attention to the game last night? Black Bears did not fare too well. The shorter one turned and lowered his voice. I couldn't quite make out what he had said till the younger one started laughing violently. You're quite the clown, you know that. Of course he's got an objective. It's something to do with those doors down there. Frankly, though, I couldn't care less what he plans as long as I get to be along for the experience. Tightening the grip on his rifle, C eyed the deer for a second. He was planning something. Haven't you ever considered it odd how he obsesses over the symbol, how he's always studying the blueprints of the town, scowling over that journal? The younger one had loudly exclaimed. He then relit a cigarette he had been holding. Don't mock me while you muck up the air and smile at me like I'm some kind of insect, growled the older one. It's a win for us all. Oh, come on now. Don't look at me like that. That's the same stare Johnson gave me. Right as he realized that he'd become an obstacle. I turned to see, completely shocked. He was ready to meet my gaze. I could tell by his wide-eyed stare that we were thinking the same thing. Solomon here. For the uninitiated, Charles Johnson was co-editor of the Eastmouth Tribune until last month. And then, one day, he just up and vanished. No signs of a break-in. His car was still in the driveway. It was quite the mystery. That was until he was found hanging from a tree at the end of Willow Way. There was much gossip in the days before they found him, but when he was actually confirmed dead, the mood became complicated. After all, the suicide of a seemingly normal person is not common in these parts. The older one, clearly uncomfortable by what had been said, left the conversation. The remaining person stuck around for a few minutes, finishing the remains of his cigarette before kicking it into the dirt and heading off towards the direction that the other went. A minute or two after he left, I'd nudged C, and we'd picked up the carcass of the deer. When we get out of here, we're not going to talk about this with anyone. Let's scram, C had said. Are you out of your tree? They just admitted knowledge of what sounded to me like a murder. We should search the area. They can't have just been here for no reason. C hadn't responded as he'd begun to lug the deer up the incline by one of its legs. I followed after him, and soon we were at the top. It was rapidly growing darker, and even though the ground had leveled out, there were still plenty of ways to stumble. Neither of us really wanted to be out here after dark. C's uncle had apparently talked about nightfall being prime for hunting. That seemed silly to me. I was about to suggest we slow down for a minute as we arrived at the scene of where the men had been standing. Then, the forest floor gave out beneath me. It was a sudden stumble that quickly met me with the cool lick of concrete as I tumbled down a series of stairs, hidden beneath a faux leaf netting. Gee whiz, are you okay down there? C had called from above. As I'd gathered my senses, I'd noted that the climb must have been nearly 8 feet. My head feels like it's been screwed on backwards. And I've got some bruises, but I'm alright. You should come check this out. But we really should be getting home right now. Oh, come on. This is exciting, isn't it? Who knows what's down there? C had sighed and then dropped the deer before heading down the eroded steps. What is this place, V? It's a bunker of some sort. Bet it's related to those 2 guys who were here earlier. Maybe it's protection against the Ruskies? C seemed skeptical. But why would it be locked up? All the way out here in the middle of a forest? What if it's filled with bodies? I'd teased. Fingers crossed it's not that. Solomon here. If I could throw a guess, it would be for keeping any snooping teenagers out. People exactly like the author of this letter. Now that I think about it, having a secret bunker would be pretty swell. C had grabbed the chain holding the bunker hatch firmly in place. This isn't going anywhere. We should just book it and get the deer home. It's not like we can't come back tomorrow. Oh, come on, don't be a chicken. I'm no chicken. That sounds like something a chicken would say, I'd said as I dug a pair of bolt cutters out of his bag. Oh, come on, what are you... And then with one harsh snap, the chain fell. Not going anywhere, you said? I knew you had bolt cutters, you scaredy cat. You always loop me into this stuff, he said, looking a bit exhausted. Help me with this hatch. After a bit of struggle, It was darker than a crawl space caked in soot. Once we had our flashlights out, we studied our surroundings. The bunker was about the right size to totally let 3 people live. 2 cots and a hammock were set up by the leftmost wall, while the center was taken up by a messy table. There was a blackboard and 2 bookshelves hugging the back wall as well. With the exception of the table, the bunker seemed too orderly for someone to currently be living there. What kind of bunker is this? It sounds like a teacher's retreat. C and I started looking around. Who do you think uses this, V? Hunters? Survivalists? Maybe a serial killer. Don't put any ideas in my head now. At least I've got my trusty Model 70. I don't think these woods are hiding any killer deer, C. As he shuffled off to the other side of the bunker, I'd started rooting around through a bookshelf and examining the blackboard. Chalk detailed a list of mostly inane plans. Summer bake sale, yearly blood drive, election budget, sewer tunnel maintenance, phone lines, Oak Creek Lutheran Church, new housing, warehouse transit. Find anything interesting yet? C had asked as he made his way back over. Nothing related to Johnson or the rambling about doors and the symbol. As I finished my train of thought, C shoved a book in my face. Now ain't this kooky, V? And boy, was he right. The book read, A Beginner's Guide to the Runes of the Old World. As I'm writing this, if I had to wager a theory, I'd say they're involved with the town council because of the chalkboard, involved with the kidnapping because of what we heard, or just nutters because, well, Heck, they might even be all three. Maybe there's some proper hippies. Those guys, I really doubt it's C. Well, whoever they are, they're certainly odd. The creepy bunker didn't give that one away. He'd furrowed his eyebrows at that, and I'd turned around to thumb through the papers on the table. It had been quite the collection. Surveys, flyers that hadn't been released, a few complaints from citizens worried some new policy might affect their children, and then a paper cut, a quick little slice as I rummaged through the documents. It wasn't like the other sheets. Whatever it was, it had been printed on heavy paper. I shoved the other documents aside and quickly motioned to C. Whoa! What the hell is a map of the sewers doing here? Well, they were talking about it. C had studied it for only a few seconds before something caught his attention. That can't be right. That's St. Gabriel's. If the map was to be believed, the sewer system connected directly to a door in the basement beneath the church. Camera, I declared as I dug through his bag and removed his Nikon F. He'd spent 3 summers saving up for it, and nearly lost it within a day. His mother was certainly not happy when she heard about his carelessness. I don't think these plans are available to the public. Golly, I hate to admit it, but I don't think we should just leave this. He was right after all, but what really grabbed my attention were 2 red circles. They had been sketched closely over one long stretch of tunnels. And what about the church? How did it all connect? The camera flash blinded us both, and C staggered back a foot. When we both stabilized back to the light of our flashlights, he spoke. We didn't find anything about the Johnson guy, and there's a pair of recently used boots under one of the cots. I think we should book it out of here. My eyes had brushed right over the boots. I remember cursing out loud, with the thought of some gruff stranger returning to his bunker, and the sudden rumbling of my stomach. I quickly made my decision. I'm glad we stayed, but you're right. Should we call the county sheriff or talk to somebody in the town council, V? Those men from earlier didn't sound like they were up to any good. I remember thinking for a moment before replying. What if some of them are in on this? Maybe, he said as the thought finally crossed his mind. I'm just starting to get awfully creeped out, and that deer is just wasting away as well. We should talk about this over dinner. With a nod on my part, we'd shuffled out into the cold night air. I shut the door behind me as quietly as I could, and then we scanned above the stairs before we finally re-emerged. As we put the faux leaf netting back over the hole, I'd gotten the strangest sense that we'd missed something. Or maybe that we weren't really seeing the full picture, Solomon. It's a feeling that I can't properly describe. As we picked up the deer and headed back towards the area we'd entered from, that feeling became something more like a fluttering anxiety, or some kind of nervous nausea. I got lost in that feeling for a while, before I started really paying attention and looking around. It was a moonless night, and a fog had started to envelop this part of the forest. As we neared the 10-minute mark, I realized something worse. We were lost. The branches seemed to twist and stretch towards us, and it became harder and harder to drag the deer as its body snagged on every invisible root or rock. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. We're lost, I'd told him. I hate to say it, but I think you're right, V. He'd groaned as he ran his firm hands through his dark hair. That sounded an awful lot like a line from a romance novel. I swear it now, if this letter was just an elaborate piece of romance schlock, I'll burn my damn radio equipment. I'll continue for now. Any bright ideas on how to not end up stranded in the wilderness for the night? These woods are dense, and it's not like we can use the moon. No kidding, C had replied sarcastically as he sat down on a log. He then did something I'd never expected. He licked his index finger and stuck it up into the night air. "We can follow the wind," he'd said. Hopefully. How can you even do that? Don't you need a compass?" "Well, sort of." And then he was silent for nearly a minute until a strong gust of wind passed. "It's going east. I think we might have been headed northeast towards Preacher's Rock before, when really we should have just been following the wind." "You sure we weren't headed towards spooky old Black Creek Shack?" I'd teased despite my anxiousness. "Cut it with the funny business. We've got to go southeast. If I'm right, we're still not too far away from the fence." I didn't have the energy to reply. I took a few drinks from his canteen, and then we set out again. A few minutes later, and we were both relieved to see the forest widening up again. Less snags for the deer, less branches to scrape against my flannel shirt. And then there was silence. A forced, sudden silence, as I shot my arm out and blocked C's movement. There had been no noise from it, but my eyes, now well attuned to the darkness, had picked out a sight. A shadow, almost human, seemed to tear apart at something small on the forest floor. An animal, or God forbid, a small child. Neither of us could tell what it was eating. It was clearly dead, at least. And then a sudden chill passed over me, as I realized it could tell that we were watching. I blinked, just a simple blink, and then it was gone. We stayed in silence before I'd nudged C to make sure that I was awake. There was more than just a mysterious bunker in our woods, Solomon. There was something feeding. I remember that I'd begun to ask him a question before he'd nervously put his sweaty hand over my mouth and readied his rifle. He was shaking, but he was ready for whatever it was. Slowly he crept towards the carcass of whatever had been eaten. I'm still not sure what we saw that night, but I'll tell you this. I'll never enter that portion of the forest, ever again. Laying on the ground was the corpse of a fox. Its torso had been removed or consumed entirely, and its neck had been snapped in such a violently wrong angle that it was nearly facing the right direction. It gazed out at us lifelessly with no fear. Whatever had killed it had been so quick, the fox never even sensed its own fate. It was sad and terrifying at the same time. No human could have done such a thing. "Screw this," I declared quietly. "I'm so damn tired of lugging this deer around. We're maybe 10 minutes from town, and with this, we can't stick around." C didn't reply. His eyes were different than I'd ever seen them. The eyes of a real hunter. Far cry from the squeamish friend I'd always known. He scanned the branches, presumably for the shadow that we'd seen. He didn't see it, but I did. Nearly 30 feet from where we stood, buried under a cloak of shrubbery, stared a set of 3 bloodshot yellow eyes. No irises, no blinking. Those floating orbs stared directly at us. They studied us patiently, entirely without emotion. It seemed as if it was figuring us out, debating whether to cut us up like the fox. I'd stifled a whimper and nudged C as I'd pointed at it. Heck, I couldn't keep still, Solomon. Not my finger, not my arm. After all, there are no such thing as 3-eyed bears, wolves, or humans. I blinked again, and then it was 10 feet closer, still hidden by the brush. I don't quite know the exact moment that set it off, but both of us began running like we were in a marathon. My breathing was rapid, and that exhaustion in my legs was all gone. The only thing I could force myself to do was to not look back. We ran, stumbling like a couple of drunken idiots, thrashing against anything that came into contact with us. I could only focus on the spinning beam of the lighthouse. Hell, we ran so fast that we didn't even notice the decline, till we each got a mouthful of grass and slammed into the rusty fence at the foot of the forest. I don't quite remember how we did it, but we managed to scale the fence and collapse onto the street next to it. There was nothing to say, and even if there was, neither of us could hardly even breathe. Well, I'm going to have to put at least part of this letter at a higher level of suspect than the first. Johnson did disappear, as you all should know. It seems this letter was written before he was found hanging from a tree on Willow Way. You all know the street, of course. The one with the ghost house. Spooky lights and all. Load of horse manure, I'd say, but he was found there. Allegedly, he was depressive, according to some of the recurring faces at St. Gabriel's. But there's enough oddities to the story to at least make one intrigued. The yellow eyes, though, I can't be the only one who's a bit doubtful of that. But hell, if anyone wants to go clearing out those woods past Main Street, past that volunteer fire station, they're welcome to write me and tell me if they find some monsters or a secret bunker. And for any returning guests that are still intrigued about the first letter, I'm ashamed to admit that I've made no real progress on cracking the code. Might as well be whatever hieroglyphs the Sumerians had or something of the like. That symbol, the eye within those two crescent moons, it's gotta have a relation, or at least some kind of meaning. It wouldn't be carefully worked into some of the town architecture otherwise. Maybe I'll get lucky. Beyond that, I'm duped. If anyone knows something, feel free to write to me about coded languages and send it to the location that two people here have already found. If you can do that, I'll consider reading your letter on air. Beyond that, I haven't got much else but that titillating story. So, just remember, dear listeners, or lack thereof, tell the town council to kiss off. Make sure to join the mini-marathon bake sale for the blood drive like the good citizen that you are. And keep your doors locked at night. There's plenty of rumors surfacing lately, and if even a tenth are true, I'd be wary. So, have a pleasant evening. Don't let the sea monsters bite.